Hello everyone, today we talk about the Roman Aquila, that is the Roman eagle, symbol of the Roman Empire, of the Roman legions, as well as of Jupiter Capitolinus, whose symbols were definitely the eagle together with the thunderbolt. These two symbols are in fact often associated in Roman iconography, and today I would like to discuss more in particular the importance that the Roman eagle had not just in the Roman world and more generally in the imperial ideology of Rome, but really trying to look at the roots of the eagle symbolism in the Indo-European identity that the Rome had, and that is often overlooked. I think that most of the people today look at the Roman Empire as this picture of modernism, a sort of a secular state, a bit like on the model of the 19th century statal forms, to say, oh, look at how modern the Romans were. And unfortunately, they have forgotten how not modern actually the Roman were, but in a positive sense. That is, I don't like the word modern. I rarely use it, telling the truth. And I think one of the greatest problems of our society is not to have grown secular, because I appreciate secularism, but the greatest mistake we have done is that attached to secularism we have forgotten the meanings of our past. That is, one thing is to be secular and still knowing that what was the world like before. We are secular today, having completely erased the memory of our traditions, of where we come from, and our identities and all. And this is being done for the Romans a lot. I'm pretty, especially very saddened when I see this even picture of the Romans as a sort of completely, in fact, secularized, a sort of completely multi-ethnical or completely different entity compared to the Indo-European peoples. Actually, one of the greatest beauty of those civilizations is all the very deeply intertwined symbolisms and beliefs and traditions that existed on the base of the Indo-European culture. The Romans were largely an Indo-European empire. Even from an ethnical point of view, when they expanded into Africa or into Syria, still the greatest bulk of the Roman or at least the subjects populations, which later were Romanized, were peoples who came essentially from the Indo-European stock, and Rome itself originated into the Italic peninsula, where the Latins and other Italic peoples had actually a very strong memory, a very strong legacy of their Indo-European past. And if you read at their symbolisms and at their religion, at their look at their art, and you realize that they were all about that. And one thing we must necessarily do when looking at those worlds is never to reason as if those were secular words like ours. You don't have to think that since the Romans were so advanced, they didn't they were reasoning essentially like us. If you at a banal level in pop culture, you see all these movies about Roman legionnaires. All you see is, yeah, there is some attention towards religion and traditions, but they're often showed just like, a little rite, or at least a relatively small part of the whole business, or in a way as if it was just a sort of a political tool, in that, I don't know, the Romans maybe themselves didn't believe that much. It is true that maybe the elites, especially when they got Hellenized, and they absorbed knowledge about certain, even in certain cases, even atheistic conceptions. Or at least they still believed in the gods, but they kind of framed them into a broader universal destiny, into which out there was practically nothing. It's very difficult to actually discuss this, but we must say that generally speaking, the vast majority of the population still held lots of such beliefs that were rooted deep back into the millennia sometimes, and there are so many analogies, so many actually common beliefs, even common language that existed between, I don't know, the the Romans. You have to think, when I'm talking about the Romans here, I'm not attaching any ethnical meaning to it, because being a Roman has exclusively one meaning, that is a political, a civic one, let's say, the one of having Roman citizenship. Then it has nothing to do with any language, any ethnicity, any religion, aside from the religion, in the sense that you should attribute honors to the imperial deities, and that was it. But in a polytheistic perspective, it was normal to pay tribute to those divinities and still believing in others, which was the norm in any polytheistic world. As you know, polytheistic, as I often say, it's a term that has been invented by monotheists. Otherwise, in the ancient world, this idea practically did not exist, and the same monotheisms actually stemmed from polytheisms. You can't see that. The angels of the Bible are nothing but the leftovers, we can say, of other Mesopotamic deities, Semitic, that exists in there. Even if you take Zoroastrianism, you see that, yes, it's a sort of monotheism, but really there are so many, it's much more complicated. It's a sort of hierarchical group of manifestations of the same deity that, however, kind of take certain individual characters on their own. I mean, it's really all much more complicated than, I don't know, monotheism, single god with nothing else. The ancient world was extremely fluid, extremely syncretic, and that's what I want to give to tell why I want to talk about the eagle. I'll be honest with you, today I wanted just to talk about the aquilifer, but that is the legionnaire, that the eagle bearer, literally. Aquila is the eagle, as we've said. Aquilifer comes from the word Latin word fero, that is to carry, to bear, in fact, and hence Aquilifer, the eagle's bearer. But that was the legionnaire who carried the eagle. That was the most important insignia, or better, of the Roman army. Of the Roman, it was a symbol of the Roman legion itself. Actually, it's not always been so, and we will see this now, because the eagle was basically issued as a standard legionary symbol, at least as the first symbol of the legion, for reasons we will see, but chiefly from usually Gaius Marius is credited for having done this. Gaius Marius is credited with lots of things, and obviously he definitely reformed the Roman army, but we have also to think that much of this is traditional. It's not that actually Marius changed every single thing. There were changes that had already been occurring in the previous times, and that he basically sanctioned and formalized. But even in there, in a very practical way, you have to think that indeed up to the Augustan times, even the Marian legions were this extreme, especially from an administrative point of view. There were still lots of difference. It was still a very fluid thing. But aside from this is not what I want to talk about. I wanted to talk about the eagle proper. And about the aquilifer, I was saying that there was too few. And you know that my videos are usually pretty long, like this one is gonna be. In practice, so I thought that it was more interesting to actually talk about the Roman eagle as such. So what the general symbolism of the Roman eagle is clear. Telling the truth, we still live in a world where the Roman eagle, or at least its descendants in some way, are all out there. Take the United States. I mean, the Roman eagle is today a general symbol of strength, of political might, of nobility. I mean, the eagle in many cultures is all over the world, anthropologically speaking, very widespread as a symbol. Today we will talk especially about Indo-European tradition, but I will have to mention obviously also certain Egyptian and Semitic traditions, because humans generally have attached a certain symbolism, a certain character to this or that animal. This is important because at the time was done with the belief that it was actually that any animal was the symbol of a certain deity. So also in here, never think it secular, think it as these people truly believed in them. So as we've seen, the thunderbolt and the eagle that are often associated into the Roman military iconography, especially, although we must say that the whole Roman society was a bit permeated with military symbols. You have to think that at the time, really, the general international ethics policy was to conquer the world, right? It really was so. I mean, if you take any great empire in history has developed certain ecumenic ambitions, we can say the Romans were some of the few ones who actually managed to do this, because they basically conquered the whole world. You say, well, they really didn't. It was just Mediterranean, the Mediterranean and the European continent. Well, yeah, okay, but at the time, for them, that was the world, essentially. They knew there was something else, especially in the East. They knew it was China and all, but you have to really think it from the perspective of the people who dwelled in the Mediterranean and in Europe, and think about what really Rome really was, and never conceive also Rome in a certain sense with borders, because even the border of the Roman Empire are actually a 19th century or invention. That is, the Romans didn't actually see the borders. If you take a map of the Roman Empire, you say, oh wow, that's where the Roman Empire started and that's where it finished, in here on the limes. But actually the Romans thought it in a completely other fashion. I mean, if you take the Rhine border, it wasn't conceived to stem the Germans. It was conceived to, with all the legions in there, to keep at bay both the Germans and the Gauls at the same time. That was the real picture, and therefore the empire, the Imperium of Rome, was something much larger and extremely, I think, overloaded with symbolisms that in part today we're gonna see relatively to the eagle. First of all, this ecumenic symbolism of the eagle stands into the sky divinity. Jupiter is the god of the sky, and he sends down thunderbolts. There are some basically the most frightening thing was the most amazing, the most spectacular thing. I mean, I can think also about earthquakes and I don't know, volcanic eruptions, but also in here we will see how actually the telluric deities were one thing in the European mindset, and the celestial ones were another. And actually the celestial ones, from the Indo-European point of view, was originally a nomadic one, were more important, definitely, or at least they had they were actually complementary. The sky couldn't exist without the earth, but the ideal was the sky, and the sky was conceived as that actually could struck the earth also partly. The thunderbolt in this sense is a very meaningful symbol. So when I'm talking about this, you don't have to think that this is something so cryptic that I don't know, I came up today with, because if you look at the classical world and art, you realize that this symbolism were actually all over, literally. Today we're chiefly talking about the Romans, but if you take Greek, we will talk as well about Greek myths and deities, so you will understand it was something larger. Just yesterday I was seeing, remembering related to this, that the eagle was the symbol also of the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt. That there are eagles on Mithridates coins, that is this Pontic sovereign that fought against Rome many wars in the 1st century BC, and that in this sense was, there was a sort of a broader cultural picture into which, this is what I want to say, into which Rome emerged, culturally speaking. You don't have to see as Rome as divided or as something different from the other peoples like the Celts or the Germans. Actually, those were all cousins in many ways, and they were actually pretty much similar. Do not look at this modern world the modern idea for which the Romans were this kind of weird thing that had nothing to do with most actually these populations were extremely similar to one another. If you take the Italics, they were pretty similar to the Celts. Even Latin is extremely similar as a language to Celtic. these things have to be understood. In my opinion, pop culture has to destroy this barrier for which thinking that the Romans were a sort of a diverse, even ethnically speaking, thing compared to. But this is maybe a bit too political. What I'm saying is, or at least it can be taken politically by someone. Maybe I will discuss it more thoroughly in another video. But today we talk about the Aquila. And so the eagle is something you can find everywhere in symbolism, in the myths, and this is what today we're gonna repercur. So relatively to the first of all, a bit of history of Rome proper. You know, where did the eagle actually starts appearing to Roman history, right? Because generally speaking, we think that Rome was the empire, and plus, and telling you the truth, I'm totally in love with the archaic Rome and Republican Rome. So I like to get back at things. When I look at the early empire, it's just too old, like too. But I'm kidding. I love the early empire, but definitely I think the first, at least the only I've found right now. I'm sure there is plenty of symbolism that can be attached, but at least historically speaking, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Dionysius of Halicarnassus is one of the most important, say, Hellenistic historians. He tells a lot of interesting things about early Rome, and it says that that among the federal insignia that the chiefs of the Etruscan cities they brought to Rome from Tarquinia after the victory of Tarquinius Priscus on there was a scepter with an eagle over it that the king basically continued to adopt for all the time of his permanence in Rome. So here we're talking actually about a mythical past. You have to think that literally everything that in Roman history that you read about before 270 BC is actually, it's not myth really, but it's legend. That is halfway between myth and history. So it's not really, there is definitely some truth, but it's mostly, that's where the Roman culture was coming from. That's how non-secular the Roman were. That's how primitive, in many ways, Roman society was. And this primitiveness of the Romans is actually not stressed, because people want to stress the fact instead that they were modern. Well, thanks my eyes, and at the time of Caesar, they were modern, but that's because they had absorbed so much from others. But the core of Roman identity, Roman culture, was really something much less developed. It was much closer to, say, the Celtic world, the Iberian world, the Germanic world, the Dacian world, than the Greek one, to which it's usually assimilated. And by the way, also the Greeks naturally emerged from the same mold. It's just that they had that had progressed faster. Okay, at least compared to these populations, Rome herself was kind of an exception into the Italic world. Already the idea of a city, something unknown to other Italic peoples, if they were when they were strongly influenced by the Etruscans or the Greeks. But generally speaking, Rome came from a cultural fabric that was extremely warlike, extremely tribal in many ways. And I discussed this especially, well, I will keep this will be a bit the leitmotif of all my Roman military history videos, because that's really it. And you find that as early as the time of the kings, the Romans, there is this idea that there was an eagle somewhere. Now, we don't know more. I personally don't know which place had the eagle into Etruscan society. I could really take a look at that, because it might be interesting. But the whole picture is pretty foggy for those times. So sometimes, however, these symbolisms are more meaningful than the actual historical precise information, because they tell us much more about the bigger picture and how they saw that. Even from later times, like in the case of Dionysius of Halicarnassus, but therefore that it was there somehow. Now we know that in 106 BC, Marius basically standard issued this sort of, say, standardized, kind of a bad word for what actually Marius practically did, even if he objectively homogenized with his reforms, the Roman army at least accelerated that process. The eagle to the Roman legions. Essentially before battle, he gave to each Roman legion, there is a legion, I don't know whether it's that he had a vision, well, whatever, not really a vision, but it was all a symbolism involving the eagle, but he basically distributed the eagles to each legion, and from that moment, the whole thing started. So what were actually the legionary symbols before? Well, probably there were many. As a matter of fact, we know that before the Roman, together, by the way, with the Roman eagles, seemingly has always been there, because these are all totemic animals that the Indo-European tribes used, and the Romans were tribesmen. Originally, the Latins were Indo-European tribesmen, like the other Italics. The Italics, certain Italic peoples even take their name from these totemic animals. The Piceni, for instance, or Piceni if you prefer the ecclesiastical pronunciation, take their name from woodpeckers, interestingly. I mean, it was over there. Even the same Roman wolf is a typical, the wolf is a typical steppes totemic animal. It's present in all European cultures, and if you see the totemisms of this is present out there, the same signiferi of the Roman army, including the eagle, the aquilifer, the eagle bearer. These guys wore wolves, leopard, lion skins. By the way, at the time, seemingly up to the times of Augustus, in Italy and Spain were lions, interestingly, still living, I mean, in the wild. Also in Greece, I think. So there were also other animals at the time. It is kind of interesting where kind of other animals now went extinct, or at least that disappeared from some regions. So this is interesting, and this is a symbolism that is evident in Roman army. You think about the berserkers who want to find a guy that wears with an animal skin that gives him magic power. It was present in every single European society. In the Roman army you see that among the ensign bearers were all covered with this thing, and that was the meaning. That was the religious meaning, that the wolf or the leopard, the lion skin would give that characteristics to the guy who was wearing them, this fighting characteristics. So never think about the Roman world as a secular world. It's plain stupid. It's like the ABC of Roman history if you want to understand it. It's not like that. And and this is already amazing. So you can immediately understand that, especially say the standard bearers were those who had generally a greater prestige, that were usually attached to the greater military leaders. It's easy to reason in terms of military terms, like the officers and NCOs and all, but really, if you take the Italics, for instance, that the Romans began to use from a very early time, together with the Roman citizens in their armies, and most Roman armies were the majority of Roman armies were made up actually of Italics, not really of Roman citizens, Roman say the Italic allies. These guys were mostly tribal. They weren't like Rome. They were raised in areas, and they weren't properly even cities as we mean it. Urbanism was just about to start. It was a very rural world. It was a very different culture from the same Roman one. These guys still they were framed, they were trained the Roman way. They had Roman instructors. Sometimes they were disciplined by the Romans, but generally speaking, they had their own leaders, and these leaders were normally chieftains. There were people who had, in those more primitive societies, a certain role, a certain prestige, and those bore the insignia of their own people, these totems that existed in there, and they were. You have to think about the colorful aspect of these armies. You have to think about all these little details, these symbolism, they were so deep, so meaningful, so heavy, and that permeated really the whole mindset of these populations. And war at the time was the main thing in society. It was you can study history up to a certain point definitely as a history of war, because that's what these people practically only made, and that was what was exalted their mindset, because the Indo-Europeans they were originally speaking all warriors in practice. Agriculturalism was, especially in the steppes, was so-so. Now that when they settled in Europe, so in areas where they could sedentarize, they evidently began to work the land and all. In fact, the Roman political state is born in the sense, in terms of with sensual classes. I made a video about the actually the very beginning of this, that is the Servian reform of the Roman army. It tells you that it was based on landed property. I mean, the criteria of recruitment and of equipment. So it's the idea of the peasant soldier, the citizen soldier, that was also peasant and had to provide for his own equipment. So all this story that I think everybody knows about how the Roman army and the Roman state has been born for, because the Roman state has been born in this sense as practically all the states in history, chiefly for military needs, because military expenses were the larger ones, and therefore the major organization of these states was based on actually being able to provide that army. Throughout all Roman history, you have to think that as for other histories and other states that existed, the civil expense were extremely little. Like 2/3 of the whole imperial budget was about the army, or even more actually. Because that's what the state paid for the rest, and that's how the empire was built. It was built on the deterrence, in absence of other coercive means that they didn't have at the time for evident technological reasons. I mean, today with guns you can keep at bay much many more people than you could do with javelins and swords. And therefore having that army was all what the empire was about, essentially, and to make people paying those minimal taxes that had extremely I mean, they were heavy in proportion for those times, but compared to us, I mean, today I don't know, there are certain countries in the West that pay like 40% of taxes. It would have been unbelievable for ancient standards, because that's that it was. In fact, the Roman state was also a pretty light state. I mean, up to the late Roman Empire, where there was an increase in bureaucracy and administration, actually the Roman state was something pretty light, and it was all about the army. So in the European mindset, the army was the first thing, because the freeman was the warrior. So even all these cultural meanings gravitated around the fact that essentially in order to be free, you had to go at war and you had to kill people. And I know it sounds bad, and it is, because today we have a wholly different thing, but you really have to think the whole world at the time actually was based on such principles. I mean, the idea of, I don't know, beheading an enemy and using his head as a trophy was something praised, because it told you that you were a man. And why? Because this was a typical another typical, say, I always say Indo-European, but this is, say, you can find it in any tribal society. The idea, if you kill an enemy, you do not just prove in this sense rationally to be a good warrior, a good fighter. It proves that you basically got his strength. This is also fascinating. So the Romans had a true passion for beheadings. That was also their favorite capital punishment, because being beheaded was a hell of a death. Being crucified was the thing done for cowards, for thieves, for people that were despised, and that's why Jesus, for instance, was crucified like that, because in that context what they wanted to do was to humiliate him. Generally speaking, it was a world to which you find this kind of tribal ethics remaining. And I made a video that can be interesting about the origins of the European chivalry, in which I discuss about this. I mean, I I tell how there is a direct link between what we see as the, I don't know, the chivalric ethics of of feudal Europe in the Middle Ages to the very Indo-European origins, and how this actually always remained there from the Indo-European migrations from the Caucasus into Europe until, during the ancient times and classical times, during the migration era, and so on, and how, by the way, these values still affect us. I mean, the idea of the individual bravery, core, these are things that date back to that. I mean, they are irrational, because today, now, we kind of rationalize the whole thing. Even the same classical world has produced this contrast between reason and emotion. The Greeks did that. For instance, they had two deities of war. It was Athena and Ares. Athena represented the reasonable war, and she always defeated Ares, because Ares was just the primitive beast who fought like hell. It was like the prototype of the Indo-European warrior, and the Indo-European warrior in this sense, still an Indo-European culture like the Hellenic one, was conceived as a loser against the mind, the reason. The Romans had Minerva, was kind of the equivalent, more or less, of Athena, and the Romans eventually also came to attribute so much to her, because the Greeks and the Romans were, say, practically the only Indo-European civilization in the West that had made it to partly rationalized, because they had to create a state to impose discipline on the army, and they had seen that with discipline they could defeat the tribal peoples that had still instead this more primitive ideal with an ethics based only on the warrior and not on the soldier. So this is very complicated, but just for saying that, anyhow, at every level, this Indo-European symbolisms were still there. So, and what is it, going back to Marius, so what was the Roman symbol between, the symbol of the Roman legion before Marius? There were several, we are told, actually. There were probably, as we were saying, more than one. So the idea is, excuse me, that there were other symbols. There was now I just remembering. It was the probably there was an ox with a human head, a sort of Minotaurus. There was the boar. Interestingly, because that's for instance the same one of the symbols also the Celts famously used, and in fact it seemingly was more widespread in northern Italy, in Cisalpine Gaul, when in fact there was Celtic, and so the legions recruited in there preferred this symbol. There were including the eagle. And others, now I don't remember. It might have been the wolf as well. Now I don't really remember everything about it. I could, if you give me a second, I can tell you which other animal I'm forgetting. But for saying that there were several, now we just got the the wolf, as a matter of fact. The horse. This is what the horse. The horse, the wolf, and the eagle, they are three typical animals that recur into all the military symbolisms of all the Indo-European cultures. All of them. And the Romans had them in their religion. So you say, okay, well, they had the symbols. Yeah, okay, maybe it was something random. No, it wasn't random. This stemmed from that origin. And they still praise it. And we don't have to think, I mean, well, at this point we are in the 1st century, in the end of the 2nd century BC. So we have to think that partially, in this case especially, the Roman civilization had gone past. I mean, especially many people believed in Rome, maybe had kind of, I can't believe forgotten, because that is also wrong, but it's like with Roman religion. At this time, the ancient Roman religion is not like the copy of the Greek pantheon. It was a completely different religion, about which we don't, by the way, know much, simply because it was so ancient, so arcane, and it's so primitive in many ways that the same Romans at the times, let's say, of Cicero or Caesar, in fact, I had partially forgotten. I mean, that they were still practicing it, all the rites, all the things, because that was a proper thing to do, but the same Romans had partly lost the awareness of the whole symbolisms, of the whole implications. Surely they knew much more than than we do about their own religion, but in terms of knowledge. But there was an evolution also in this sense. But it's still very meaningful that you have these cultural persistences from that common mold that evidently was not forgotten. And the Roman eagle was usually made up in you have seen it in movies, in reenactments. You know, it's like a pole with an eagle over that. The eagle is often represented by kind of holding grabbing a thunderbolt with its claws, and that's a very powerful symbolism, because that's a symbol of Jupiter. That eagle is Jupiter, and that's Jupiter resents the thunderbolt against and this is interesting, against whom? Because basically the Romans at this point were claiming to go there together with Jupiter. They thought that Jupiter was their own. I mean, take the temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus in Rome. There's this amazing thing that the Romans had built. If you go in Rome to visit that, you can still see the basement of that. It was something huge. That god, Jupiter was Rome in that sense, and that was their main divinity. And they were, in this sense, they were fighting for Jupiter and to satisfy him in the contractualistic mindset of the ancient world, and it was their major divinity. But in this sense, Jupiter was the great father of the other gods. It was the greater god. It was the god of the sky. So it was something much more transcendental, even beyond the canonization that eventually was made of the ancient gods into the Hellenistic world, you know, as we know it as today with the sanctioned pantheon. But even the Greeks, telling the truth, had that hadn't existed like that. They also had this different gods. The Greek police at the beginning had their own divinity, for instance. So you have to think it fluidly, and with lots of beliefs attached that partly, unfortunately, for the greatest part, unfortunately today we have lost. It is something, if I think about it, it makes me want to cry, because I don't know what it gave to know how it really was, what it was really around it. But it was grand, it was big, it was something great. It was, we can't understand it properly. It's really that it was about how they really all thought of the world. It's too powerful to express even in our terms. I don't think we can as modern people, we can't really grab it. We can't really understand what it really meant for them. But it was something great, really. And so Marius, as we have said, eventually this issued this during the Cimbrian Wars, by the way, before fighting against the Germans, gave all these, and then these eagles were carried together with other symbols, with other insignia of the army, of the legion, of the emperor. Okay, the emperor later, but even certain generals were kind of. The Roman general was eventually, during the triumph, was crowned with laurels, and that meant that he was made god for one day in practice. And the laurel is the symbol of Jupiter. That is basically as if that general had been Jupiter himself, because This it was a compliment actually to the divinity more than else. But it's fascinating that on the chariot during the triumph there was one guy sitting next to the general with the laurel and being acclaimed by all the people who reminded him to be just a man. He's famous, but it's still very meaningful to remind because that's how they saw that. It was really the favor of the gods, and in that case of the greatest god of all. So this eagle was usually probably there are no surviving eagles. As a kind of a sad thing. We have a very few actual original materials surviving from such a vast time like the Roman times were, which gives you the dimension about how few we actually know about that world in practice. It was probably made into, but there is a lot of symbolism of eagles scattered all around. Think about the Augustus of Prima Porta, or there is also much funerary evidence, because by the way the imperial symbol was one of the eagle, because it was felt to be in direct connection with Jupiter. So we have lots of iconographical evidence of what these eagles could really be. They were usually made in silver or in gold. Usually they're gold, and they're made in gold, so the most precious metal, or at the time, and the and we think that from Augustan times especially it was all in gold, but maybe before there were other materials. Also you have to think that these totemic symbols probably, well, originally, I mean, gold maybe was not that available everywhere, and even especially for smaller insignia that were other materials definitely. And what is important about this is the Roman eagle was sacred. So in the Roman army it was kept by the first century of the first cohort that theoretically had to be the best unit in the whole legion, and that was essentially the most prestigious one, the primus pilo, the centurion of the first cohort, the first century, the first cohort was conceived like the best guy there, the best soldier. Was a lot of competition also for progressing into the cohorts, because that's how the centurions were promoted. The first cohort was the best one. It was were the best officer, NCOs better, because the centurion was an NCO. Could arrive to, and it had attached. The whole Roman army was all about religion, really, and the eagle was the maximum religious symbol in a Roman legion. And it was the eagle in this sense was kept very jealously in the Roman castrum, together with the other so-called signa militaria. I say signa because that's how we believe it was pronounced. If you want the ecclesiastical pronunciation is signa, so it's signa or signa militaria. That was kept inside the edes or Ides Signorum, or Edes Signorum. That is literally the altar of the signs. The Ides or Edes is the altar proper, and in Latin it has a markedly religious meaning attached to it. It's not just the altar of physically in our secular mind. It's the altar really. It's the place where you put the offers for the god. So where there is this moment of contact between the skies and the earth. So here God, the Jupiter, the god of the sky, etc. So that's very powerfully, it's very powerful. And in this sense, the signa were conceived as something that were touching the sky. You know, that the Roman legion was essentially blessed by the gods, because the whole army had put its insignia into them by placing them on the altar. So this is very meaningful, telling the truth. This such practices survived. I was just reading a 14th century source, and there were certain military insignia that were blessed on a Christian altar. So kind of meaningful. This was actually pretty widespread also in medieval times in the Christian world, so it's nothing to be surprised of. But just for saying that certain practices were still there, they're much closer than we can imagine. And the Ides Signorum was one of the buildings of the so-called Principia. That is the legion headquarters. So yeah, that's how important it was really for them. They were located into the heart of the camp. It was, if you want to understand the Roman army, you have to understand ancient religion, because there is no way to understand it otherwise. And then there was obviously the Aquilifer, that was this responsible. He was an NCO. He was a junior NCO, whose duty was obviously to guard the eagle and to defend it in battle. Doesn't matter, in front of the eagle, the individual man life, it was meaningless, and it's kind of obvious and natural. This is true also in modern. I mean, the insignia of a unit are the unit in itself. So it's better to die than to make the insignia falling to the enemy hands. It was the greatest dishonor you could have, the greatest shame, to make your insignia fall into the enemy's hands. And at that time it was considered, I mean, today nobody, I mean, maybe the single soldier, if he had a great, especially these, I don't know, think about special forces, or at least certain corps that are particularly proud about their traditions. Maybe a levy soldier doesn't give that much because he doesn't have maybe the necessary esprit de corps. It surely has, I mean, in part. I remember even it's evident. There is a sort of esprit de corps every time you get into a unit, a certain form of. But what I mean is that today we don't have that religious attachment to it. In those times, it was really something that people believed, that if the military insignia fell into the enemy's hands, this was an offense to the gods. I mean, it's not a matter. It was really a matter of having failed as humans in earthly matters. I mean, having lost a battle, all the consequences that could bring to. But the fact that those insignia were sacred. So it was meant that if you lost them, you made some god mad, and in this case, the symbol of the eagle was symbol of Jupiter. Think about the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, when the Germans managed to capture all those. Which were, how many were they? 4, 3, I don't remember. Eagles. I mean, can you imagine the despair for such event to happen? Because it really meant that with that god you were done, because that was the eagle was the same symbol of the empire. Jupiter was the god that protected the same empire. So you had lost those eagles. It doesn't matter that there were other legions you could rise with other eagles. It doesn't matter. That was having made Jupiter mad, and that would have brought his wrath on the same empire. So it was really believed like that, or at least that's what the common Roman would have believed. And the politics had to deal with this. Think about the despair of Augustus when he heard of the Teutoburg Forest and of the eagles. I mean, I repeat it, we cannot understand it. Today we can't. We don't have the cultural understanding for really being in those people's minds. But it was really something that permeated the whole society, and it was felt deeply as such. So, by the way, the eagles that were falling in the battle of Jupiter Forest were three, as I remember now, and by the way, for instance, during the Batavian revolt in the 70s of the first century AD, at a certain point, the Roman eagles were actually given to the enemy, to the Germanic enemy, because that was the symbol of basically the disbandment of the four entire legions, of the four entire legions, and in other cases was, however, a great symbol of shame and an ignominious symbol, like for instance to the Gallic Legion in 17 BC, or to the 12th Legion Fulminata in 66 AD, in the First Judaic War. So the insignia were defended till death. Or, however, during the battles, another use of the insignia was actually to stand, the word symbol to stand your ground. This is also very important. There are many, in Republican times, we even know of moments into which, during the battle, the centurions threw the unit's insignia into the enemy lines in order to spur the unit, the centuria, to go there, the centuria, say better, to go get him, and in the process slaughtering the enemy, because they would have preferred to die at the hands of the enemy than suffering the shame of having lost the insignia. Obviously, this is a very ideal, very Roman propaganda-like, but you don't have to underestimate it, actually, because it might have really, for someone, if not for most of these Italic warriors, that they're in their mindsets that was really the thing. And we know that this happened in other Indo-European peoples, like fleeing in general. Think about actually the same Tacitus, the same Romans wrote about that for the Germans, that fleeing equated into the Germanic society to be ostracized, to be exiled, or even worse, to basically these warriors were coming home, were not recognized by their families anymore. It was as if they were dead, and they had no other option but go outside the village and hang themselves at a tree. So this is how powerful really things could be. In terms of military, in terms of courage, of prowess, and the insignia was the symbol, in a certain sense, of how you treated the insignia was really, it really reflected the quality of the same unit. And usually these symbols were planted, were fixed on the ground during the battle to say, now we stand here, and that's where we remain. Doesn't matter how it goes, maybe till the very end. And so they had also this kind of material function, also because these symbols were evidently also used for tactical, for maneuvers, for identifying the units. That was during battle, it was the most important thing, and that's why insignia are present in all the armies of history. But that's also, you have also to think more importantly at the meaning which they were loaded. And the eagle's head was also often represented in many symbols, especially the Roman officials, the Roman generals were already in their equipment, in their armor, they were always decorated with these eagles, because that was really the symbol of the virtue of the gods. And by the way, another very important thing, going back finally to the symbolism, the Indo-European symbolism, is that well, let's finally start this. So so you realize the Olympic and heroic meaning that the eagle has, and let's really go see what it more deeply meant in other cultures, and then coming back on the Roman one more specifically, but thinking as we were saying before, how these societies were intertwined. So this we have seen how the eagle was the sacred animal of the most Olympic god for excellence, that is Zeus, the Hellenic Zeus, and Zeus is the general Aryan Hellenic, let's say, figure. So that is Jupiter. In this sense, was loaded with other meanings from the Italic background that the Romans had, but it was still this broad sky divinity that all Indo-Europeans had in some measure. And so it's the divinity of light, of royalty. Of royalty meant obviously in terms of nobility, not royalty in, I mean royalty as a military leader. This is also very important, because that's how, by the way, Indo-European societies were based on military leaders, not just on leaders that were, because it was thought that the glory, the military might, was taken from the skies, from the sky divinity, and therefore if the military leader was victorious, it was thanks to that, and that's what you had to follow. So all these nomadic symbols like the wolf, the horse, the eagle, of animals that actually move quite fast, or at least the space a lot, because that was the nomadic ideal of these Indo-European tribes when they were still nomadic raiders essentially, and where the only political bond was based on these military bands of warriors that followed the victorious leader, because that he was guided by those gods, by the sky god and those animals that symbolized military abilities. So we've seen also how the thunderbolt is associated to Zeus, to Jupiter, and and it was coupled very often with one of the eagle itself. So the general, let's say, think about Zeus in the Hellenic mythology. Basically, he uses the thunderbolt to kill the Titans. So the Titans, this has a extremely broad meaning, because I will try to be concise about it, but essentially the Titans, this is the clash that you find in the Asi and Divani, in the Germanic tradition, that you find it, the clash between the gods and the Titans into the Hellenic religion. It's really the fight between the sky gods of the Indo-Europeans and the fertility gods of the art gods, the terrestrial gods of the sedentary society. So in all the Indo-European mythologies, we have this big clash at the beginning of times that actually symbolizes the attrition that existed at the beginning of the Indo-European settlement into sedentary civilization between these sky nomadic deities and these agricultural telluric ones of the agriculturers, of the sedentary peoples. So it's interesting that eventually in all these religions the sky and terrestrial gods are eventually get together, because that symbolizes the mix that eventually occurred between the nomadic invaders and the sedentary subjects in some measure. So the Aryans, generally speaking, believed that there was this metaphysical clash between the Olympic and Titanic forces, and in a broader sense, the Romans, but not just the Romans. This had been done also by the Hellenistic rulers. They basically had developed the eagle symbology by stressing the fact that obviously appealing to I don't know how to say that. Wait a second. To invoke the sky divinity that was felt like the one of war, because evidently it is the divinity of war couldn't but come from the sky, still in this sedentarized Indo-European civilization, so that had already been transformed from the original set. While the Titans, this was done chiefly at an ideological level by the great empires like the Roman one. The barbarians were the Titans. The Titans that in this sense the barbarians were thought to be kind of strong. The Titans were strong, physically speaking and all, but were kind of dumb. They weren't so refined, sophisticated. Now this is interesting because it kind of, you might think the other way around, right? Like the sedentary civilizations had produced this more idea that their gods were the most thoughtful ones. Instead they weren't, and this is very meaningful because the most thoughtful ones were definitely the ones who waged war on a regular base, like the nomadic ones of the steppes, which actually tells it all about war. And I could open a huge parenthesis about this, but this war requires reason. It requires quick mind. It requires being able to make fast decisions, to take and evidently this kind of more of superior, even intellectual ideal was embraced by the Romans, by the Greeks, more towards this towards deities like Athena, indeed, that was eventually taken as the great, like the Roman Minerva, the goddess of war, the one that was admired in many ways. The Romans were probably even more, well, I don't know, maybe the figures of Ares and Mars were also very, very important in these cultures, but they still were loaded with other meanings. Like, eventually these civilizations came to praise more Athena and Minerva than Ares and Mars, for what we have explained, because they were actually at that point not tribal societies anymore. So they understood that victory came from the reason, from discipline, from order, and not from the general individualistic mindset of the warrior. That is, the Romans struggled like hell in order to impose a discipline on all these Italic warriors, because those were truly indisciplined, like the Celts. Like, I mean, they were pretty similar in this sense, and it took really a lot before the Romans created this disciplined legions and all, and yet they were never able to completely eradicate the individualistic mindset from the Roman legionnaire, and on the contrary, they managed to couple it effectively together with discipline. That's something you can see also from their equipment. Well, I will discuss this in our moment. Let's just stick to in the Indo-European symbolisms. Or better, let's start from the general meaning of the eagle, also in other traditions, like the Egyptian one, that is evidently not Indo-European, but still had an influence. I mean, the symbol of the eagle, and also of the thunderbolt, have certain overlooked meanings. First of all, the idea of immortality. The Aryans were obsessed with the idea of immortality, because it's not the simple survival from death to death, but it's kind of the participation to a sort of heroic and royal state of conscience that defines actually the celestial deity. When I say celestial, it means Olympic. If you this idea that we're in the sky. However, the Mount Olympus in Greek mythology is a mountain that exists in Greece. By the way, I would love to see that. By the way, one day. But it's a metaphor to say it was such a tall mountain that arrived to the sky. It's because there were all the clouds at the top. But that it's a broader picture of the celestial. It's a metaphor, an adaptation of the celestial world of the pure sky that existed in the Aryan world. So talking about ancient Egypt, it's fascinating to see that the figure of Ba. Ba is it's a sort of superior part of the soul. if I'm not wrong, in Egyptian mythology. It's like in the Egyptian hieroglyphs is represented either as an eagle or as an hawk. So that it's kind of natural, because in Egypt I don't think there are many eagles. I think there are more hawks than anything. But it's kind of, it's a general symbolism of those kind of animals, of predators, and this even kind of this association with death in part. It's like a bit like the crow in the Germanic mythology. I mean, this, because the importance about it is that you find even in Odinism is this fact that these animals were the link between skies and earth, because they fed themselves with corpses, essentially. That could be even the corpses of the fallen warriors, and therefore it's as if they brought that to the sky. They were a sort of inferic deity that brought the soul in its travel from the earth to the skies. So that was the real thing. So in the books of the dead in the Egyptian mythology, basically the transfigured soul of the dead is pretty scary to the same gods, because this Bab basically says, I am reborn like a hawk or an eagle, and as a divine being, essentially, that Horus, of which Horus had made me essentially participate to his own, to look like his own spirit, and therefore in order to take possess to what in the other world corresponds to Osiris. This is the point. So this wait a second. This divine, say celestial nature is. I mean, Osiris it's a divine figure that corresponds to the primordial solar state of the spirit, of the soul, practically. And when it basically gets altered and corrupted, because Osiris at a certain point gets killed and decomposed, it's basically torn apart. It's being restored by it eventually gets restored by Horus. So. This basically the dead participates to this process that into which it kind of rebirth. It's kind of reborn and recomposed by these two deities, according to the myth. So this is frightening, because it basically even the gods in the Egyptian mythology were fearful of the eagle and of the oak, because it could bring death even to them. So it was the only being, the eagle was the only being that was scary also for the same gods. So you have to think that Egypt for a long time was the most advanced civilization that existed into the Mediterranean basin, and there were lots of influences of these conceptions even into Greece. So into Indo-European populations that eventually were impressed by these myths, and maybe had already surely had something already in common with them, even if they weren't Indo-Europeans, and that eventually absorbed by this. In the Hellenic mythology, you understand that the eagle has a great importance too. Take the myth of Ganymede, the cupbearer of the gods. Basically, Zeus kidnaps Ganymede to bring him to the skies and to have it as his heavenly cupbearer. And the interesting thing is that Zeus goes on earth transfigured as a big eagle. In fact, if you Google Ganymedes, you see all these beautiful works of art that have been produced since classical times. This very big eagle that is Zeus, and that kidnaps Ganymedes, who is a man, and that gets brought to the skies. Now, so here you see that this link between between the sky and the earth is represented by the eagle, and it represents Zeus himself. Getting to the Aryan Persian tradition, the king Caicus tries to basically rise up to the sky, like Prometheus in the Hellenic mythology, and it's obvious something against nature. You know, it's full in many. Think about the myth of Gilgamesh, even if the sky in there, I think it's not present. And you know, the idea, however, that even these these kind of heroic figures, so that are the best of mankind, try to reach the sky, but eventually they fail. So in that Persian myth, I mean, in the Indo-Aryan tradition, for instance, the eagle is, going back to immortality, is the animal that brings to Indra the mystic sap that will make him lord of the gods, the sap that gives immortality, or that allows to regenerate, if I'm not wrong. Now I might be confused, but it's always the eagle. In the think about in the classical world, there was also this picture that the eagle, think about it, that was the only animal that could stare at the sun. I don't know if you realize, I mean, today we have, you know, digital, we have a freaking amount of technology. We can scope everything, we can rationalize everything. But think about the ancient world. The eagle was thought to be the only animal that could reach the sky, reach the sun. And think about the divine meaning of this. If you look at the Gospel of St. John, the symbolism of St. John's Gospel is the eagle, because it's meant to be basically this. St. John's Gospel is the most exoteric of all the Gospels, we can say. It's the one inside, because the eagle is the symbol of the bird that reaches God. It can reach up to the sky, that elevates above the others. It can reach. It can take a closer look at God. So that's the symbol, even in the Gospels. Think about the myth of Prometheus that we were mentioning before. Prometheus steals famously the celestial fire from the gods, and to give it to mankind. So this is the myth basically that gives. It's a bit like Adam and Eve, like the idea that mankind at a certain point got a certain knowledge that kind of ruined the whole thing, because up to that point mankind didn't know fire. So they lived in caves. Well, actually in the myth of Prometheus, it's a kind of dark picture already of humanity there, but the fire is given to them. Prometheus gets, now we will see that, he gets tormented forever, for eternity. But at that point mankind creates, with God, with fire, it starts creating things that are even, I mean, it kind of starts building civilization, just like Cain does when he kills his brother and is sent by God into the world, say, and he starts building cities. So this is kind of, that's a Semitic myth naturally, but there are many intersections also in here. And fire kind of represents something that it's partly also with fire you can forge weapons, for instance. So it has a very, even relatively to warfare, has a great meaning. The idea that war is something sacred by excellence. It's something that it's divine, even in some measure, and therefore waging war with fire is as if having a celestial weapon with you, which implies a tragedy of human being, because that's not meant to be for mankind, but for some reason, like Prometheus stealing that fire, has entered into human society. So obviously war is something dreadful, it's something destructive and all, but it kind of makes mankind participate the the celestial power. Now Prometheus is famously punished by being chained to a rock and being eaten during the day by having his liver eaten by an eagle. And then the liver regenerates in during the night, and then the following day the eagle comes to devour his liver and again. And what's the symbolism of this? It's the symbolism of the eagle is the divine punisher. It's basically the power of the skies that destroys mankind continuously, at will, without hope, without end. So this is how, think of the fear that was attached even to the eagle. I mean, this Roman eagle marching against the enemies. It's like the message is, look that this is the divine power approaching. It's not about us Romans. I mean, we as Romans, we are disciplined, we are well armed, we're well equipped, we have big army, we have big empire, but it's all thanks to the celestial God. And we have come up to this place at the border of the world to conquer you because God is with us. Now, this is, you realize the echo of this, that it happened many times in history afterwards, but that was really felt in that way. It's terrifying. And you have to realize that enemies of the Romans actually understood this, because partly were Indo-Europeans themselves. Others, however, had this general idea that they knew the symbolism, and they feared that, because they didn't say, okay, but we have our own god, because from a politicalistic point of view, you could have your own tribal god of the place of wherever you were. But those guys had the big god, the big one that could crush your little god. So that's why religion is so important in this manner, because it really tells it all. We will go back to Roman symbolism, and we will also quote something about how the eagle was really about the Roman eagle in actual fact, and but we will arrive at the Romans at the end of this. So it's the imminent punishment of God that the eagle embodies. The eagle is the only animal that can look at the supreme light. Mankind can't. And if he will try to do that, he will get destroyed. So that's so powerful as a meaning. And so this is supramism a little bit, right? And it's like Nietzsche. I mean, it's the mankind that gets basically destroyed by itself ultimately, because it gets against the same laws of nature in the first place. And it's a very powerful metaphor, culturally speaking, for saying that mankind has its own limits in practice. So it's a very deep thing. There is also in the Bible in a different way, in a monotheistic perspective, but substantially, it's even in there you find this original fluidity in part of how the system really was. Think about Lucifer. I mean, Lucifer. Think about Lucifer in the Bible. Lucifer means the light bearer. Well, he was the best of the angels. He gets lost, basically, because he wants to substitute to God, and he becomes Satan. And God is in the sky, and Satan is underground. We realize how mixed religions are, and that's and how their message are so powerful, because they all stem basically from a shared anthropological perspective, and so in the Vedic religion, there is a variant of Prometheus myth. There is Agni, famously, whose figure is often represented as an eagle or as a hawk as well. The Vedic religion would be the one that the Indo-Europeans from the steppes brought into India when they conquered India, and that's also very rich in this tradition. It's one also actually also one of the aside from some of the most influential, because even Mitra, for instance, is believed as a sort of Eastern thing. Actually, it's an Indo-European thing. It came from India, from there, then flowed into Persian, got as a sort of unique god, but the origin actually comes from there. So if you think about how eventually all the world Indo-European religions kind of got mixed together. So Agni rips off a branch of the cosmic tree, and he repeats the act, and the idea was that he wanted to become similar to the gods. It's like the Semitic myth of the Bible with Adam that eats the forbidden fruit. It's the same thing. It reads kind of the negative act. And Agni is at the same time personified by fire. Fire in Vedic and Indo-European culture, as we've said, is, remember Prometheus as well, the fire steals fire. I mean, it's this purifying thing. Fire is, it's all one with metallurgy, with all the rituals that were attached to the magic spells that were done while forging new weapons and conferring that soul. The weapon is the symbol of the warrior. I mean, it's really that intertwined. So Agni is hit, and when he falls, I mean, he was covered with plumes, and when his plumes follow the terrestrial soil, so here we get back from the sky to the earth. These plumes give origin to a seed, to a plant seed of a plant that will produce the terrestrial soma. Now the soma is this, it's this sap, the equivalent of the ambrosia that you find in the Hellenic mythology. That is that basically is able to make you live again, but in the immortal sense of the that we have seen. That is not just living forever. It's a sort of moment of joint with God, of participation to the divine nature. So this magic sap that in the Vedic religion is then very, very important. It has always there is a lot of revolving around this. You see here, it's very similar to the Egyptian myth. Like Osiris dies to be resurrected thanks to Horus, and also in here Agni gets struck, and from his body there is this sap that is able to give life once again in a divine sense. So it's this eternal obsession of mankind with death, with the hope of winning death. It's something you find also in Christianity. Even in there, you have basically to drink Christ's blood and eat his body, and that's partly it. That's really where part of the same story, really. And so what is fascinating about it is that there is a sort of a rectification. There's a sort of salvific message, because there is always the death at the beginning, and it comes from a disaster. But at a certain time, there is the emergence of a seed that basically not just solves the problem, but also realizes the rebirth in a divine fashion. It's as if, I believe, anthropologically speaking, it derives from the idea that that humans have this sort of purification that has to be accomplished after someone's death, and that gives you this sense of even having survived that tragedy that seems like the worst thing that can happen. So now I'm speculating, and I think that the fact that you find it in so many cultures has really a very powerful meaning. Going back to the Persian culture, let's talk about the Kvarena, what it should be. It's in a Western world for a Zoroastrian concept that basically means glory. And the glory, now I talked extensively, I think, about the Sassanid army recently, and I hinted at all the symbolisms. Also, the eagle has a great symbol. The Kvarena, the Persian glory, is embodied by an eagle. In fact, in the Persian symbology, you find the eagle as the symbol of the empire. So it wasn't an abstract concept. I mean, for us it seems abstract. For them it really wasn't, because the Kvarena was conceived as a mystical force and a power that came from the above, and that eventually descended over the sovereigns and on the leaders. That then in this sense were made participating to the immortal nature and witnesses itself throughout victory. All Indo-European thing. The Persians believed indeed that their military glory derived as an empire, both in the Achaemenid times, the only truth, and also in the later ones, the Parsians and the Sassanids, as Indo-Europeans, that their power, their empire, were justified by the divine glory that corresponded also to this immortal nature. So it's this divine nature that really the great king, the king of kings, like it was called into Persia, really had, and that gave him this mighty power to destroy. No surprise that Alexander the Great was fascinating with those beliefs, because even him came from essentially that Indo-European background and wanted to put this at the maximum, to rise it at the maximum, the highest levels, as in Persian culture it had been developed. So the Greeks ideologically stressed the fact that the Persians were these tyrants, the Persian kings were tyrants, but actually that's because well, here maybe it's very complicated, but what is important is that even the Persia, as an that is conceived often as an Eastern thing, actually was an Indo-European thing. In part, that idea of conquering over the vanquished by celestial sanction was a much more European thing than the Greek polis, that was actually a sort of more rationalized idea of society, of politics. And I'm not saying it was better or worse, but I'm just stressing the fact that actually this celestial nature of imperial power that we find in ancient Rome actually was present also in the Persian Empire and in other Indo-European civilizations. So it was all one. Actually, it doesn't make even sense to distinguish them, because they were all part of the same cauldron. And what is interesting about the Avestic Kvarena is that in this Mazdaistic tradition, as we've said, glory is embodied by the eagle, and this eagle is so pure, it's such a sacred symbol that it doesn't tolerate any form of virile edicts being leaded, being offended. And in fact, according to the Persian myth, the eagle abandons the sovereign when he says a lie, when he tells lies, because the lie, this is something that even I think Herodotus tells about the Persians, that the Persian nobles were taught always to tell the truth. And if you read it from Herodotus, you might say, oh well, that's just a story and that's weird. No, it's not weird. Because those guys were essentially believing that their glory, their military might, their political authority stemmed from the celestial eagle of the sky divinity. So, going finally back to Rome, and I hope not to get emotional because this is really so beautiful and it kind of cracks me every time, but I will try to to keep my nerves. Ancient Rome. The eagle has in ancient Roman culture a huge importance, and which was I mean, we are lucky that Rome eventually made it to be an empire because we can see how beautifully it was conjugated. Think about art, Roman art and all that. And the eagle figure is especially attached to the imperial apotheosis. So the imperial apotheosis was basically the deification of the emperor's soul in practice. And therefore Roman society was, I mean, the Roman imperial ideology was fully adhering to the celestial ideal in practice, to this fact that the Roman emperor is not just a ruler like anyone else. I mean, he's called emperor. What does that mean? He has the Imperium, that is a strictly military power. The Roman Imperium in this sense is basically the same concept that stood at the base of the Indo-European world. That is, you don't have an authority of some kind. Or better, your authority is all one with your military power. And this military power is given by the sky. By Jupiter in the case of Rome. So the idea is that the emperor as a figure, obviously the Romans never really made it to make the emperor a god. Also because the Indo-Europeans in this sense were still, I mean, they couldn't make it a sort of dynastic thing. As we've seen, the Europeans believed that there was some divine power into victorious military leaders, but it's as if they had been possessed by it. It's not that the actual person, the actual human being was divine. It was gifted by divinity in practice. So that was about it was about the divinity. It wasn't about the in fact, we will see now with the decursio, the Roman decursio, how this was showed also in the Roman culture. But it was, now it's complicated to tell, but I think most of you know actually the institutional transformation of the brought to from the Roman Republic to the so-called Roman Empire. Technically, by the way, there was never such a thing like a Roman Empire from an institutional point of view. I mean, Rome has always remained a republic formally. Even in imperial times, it was just the emperor was seen in this sense as, first of all, as a sort of primus inter pares. This is the princeps name that actually means prince. That is also in here an Indo-European belief that doesn't say he is rex, that is king. He is a prince, that is essentially a leader. He's the first, literally. So the first of many. Even if it's not explicitated, but that's kind of, in fact, the Romans, when, if I'm not wrong, when they talked about the Germans that had this, that they elected their leaders every once in a while, just for waging war, I think they called them principes, but I could be wrong, but it kind of the sense is that it was not really a king because, by the way, now I'm approximating also because there were some try at a certain point to attach a certain dynastic divinity in the Aryan world, even in the Germanic world. That happened at a certain point. In some cases it succeeded, in others it failed. But let's say that the idea of the Roman prince was exactly this, that it is someone that is elected for a temporary role, that may be even for life, like for Augustus, for instance, that began what we call the empire, but it was really about the Imperium in itself. I mean, the Imperium already existed before the empire. It was the power attached to the consuls or to the other Roman magistrates who had a military, were conferred by the Senate and the people of Rome a military authority by entrusting them the command of the legions in practice, or better, the right for recruiting them, because they were recruited at that time still. There was no permanent army yet, but with the empire, in this sense, the value of bearing arms was something sacred. And there is a direct tradition. Think about the cingulum militaris, this the military belt into which you could carry this sword. That is something from which the same Western militia, that is the midas, the knight, the medieval knight, actually originates, and it's something also in there very religious, very which was reinvigorated, especially during the migration era, with all these waves of horse riding peoples from the steppes, often of Aryan origin, that rebroke that in some fashion. Think about Excalibur. That came seemingly from a Sarmatian tradition, and the Sarmatians attributed to the sword, I mean, to be this kind of alter ego of the knight's soul. So think about and probably in ancient Rome, the rite of apotheosis, it was something extraordinary, and basically it happened at the funeral of the emperor, and during certain rites, an eagle was freed over the funerary pyre, that basically and it symbolizes the passing to the state of God of the dead emperor's soul. So a moment of great a very solemn moment. So think about the death of Augustus, of the funeral of Augustus. We know that this rite was carried out at that moment, because that what it was instituted, and basically the body of Augustus was closed into a coffin covered in of purple. There is something that recurs in the purple also. You think about the Byzantines and all. And in the and brought over a golden and an ivory sort of litter, the litiga in I think it's in Latin, and so the emperor's coffin was placed on this I don't know, you say, I think it's pyre in English, that was by the way placed on the Campus Martius, that is the Mars field. So a place where the Romans traditionally exercised themselves for war. And this detail is very important because it tells you that this passing of the Roman Emperor soul from the body to the sky, let's say to the earthly nature, to the divine, to the celestial one, was carried out in the center of the Roman military. So it was not just a civil thing, like ideal. No, it was about war. Like the emperor there was celebrated as a war leader, and his coffin, the pyre was surrounded by priests. And at this point, the cursio proper, the cursio practice was carried out. Now this was beautiful. Basically, the pyre was set on fire, and the eagle was freed from the fire. Now I don't know. This is something to me. Because it was believed that the body, the soul of the dead, symbolically rose up to the skies, to be embraced by the gods. Now this is so. What happened is that the Cursio, about which we were talking about, was this run that happened, that it was carried out to the emperor's around the emperor's pyre, and the Cursio was carried out by the Roman knights, the equites, and other military chiefs that basically did one beautiful thing. They threw all their rewards that they received during their service for their valor into the fire, into the burning coffin. So this is probably one of the most beautiful thing that for which I think I am ashamed actually to live in my own world, but not because I would prefer to live in there, but because we have forgotten this. As I was saying before, there is nothing wrong in being secular, in not actually believing in these things anymore. But what I find sad is that nobody knows about these things today. That are our past. These are our history. And I don't know how, there are such deep meanings into this, that if you think that all we do today is we are this bunch of imbeciles, like just clicking on the smartphones, like, and these people had at the time had conceived such deep philosophical thinking. It's I don't know why, and so basically this Roman belief, that is an Aryan belief substantially, and is that in the military leaders stood the decisive force for victory. That is, that in the chiefs, in the military leaders, was present the celestial element that was tributed to them. So the military leader, in this sense, assumes the symbols of the celestial god, of Jupiter for the Romans, and that the military leader who came victorious from the campaigns was crowned with laurels, but eventually he would go to the temple of Jupiter, and to repose the laurels of victory into it. That meant expressing that the true odor of victory was God and not his human nature. So in the Cursio was happening the same thing. The soldiers and the military leaders were giving back, essentially returning their rewards that reminded them of their courage, of their victorious force, of the imperial victorious force, to the person that in his celestial powers was now at the point of freeing himself from human nature, and through to transhumanate in this sense, like as we've seen in the Agni, in the Vedic religion with the and to kind of coming back to the origin of that might. Now this is probably one of the most beautiful thing, and sometimes we get the impression, by the way, that the Romans were opposed, I don't know, to the Germans. If you take the Germans that eventually took up the Roman Empire, at least from the Roman perspective, they created with Charlemagne. They took the title of Roman emperors. Then the Holy Roman Empire assumed the eagles because that was legitimately believed to be the Roman Empire. But sometimes we sense, and this is probably one of the most stupid things we can do, that the Germans destroyed Rome. Now I realize, well, okay, without the Germanic invasions, maybe the Western Empire would have survived. But this is a kind of that is a kind of contingent thing that happened in that fashion for many reasons. Actually, the Germans enjoyed Rome and Roman civilization and wanted to participate to the benefit, to share the benefits of it, but they weren't culturally, ideologically opposed to it, because the symbol of the empire in this sense was essentially the same one they conceived with their military bands, their comitatus, that is. In this sense, the comitatus and the sippe in the Germanic world were essentially this. The comitatus was the military, celestial, Indo-European stuff. The sippe was kind of the pre-Indo-European world of the nature of agriculture and all. And when the Germans migrated and they took this kind of military names, they take the Longobards that chose Odin as their adoptive father and went to be some of the most warlike peoples out there. It was because they were convinced that, just like the Romans did with Jupiter, that Odin would give them victory. And so it was. So what's the difference between the Romans and the Germans? There is no difference from this point of view, from an ideological point of view. That's the same origin. Those are the same myths, the same religions, even the same language. Pater in Latin, it's father, and Vater in German, it's father. In English, father is father. So, do you understand? And there is no mutual relation, like the Vater of the Germanic tribes was there. It's not that they copied that from the Latins. The same term exists into Indian, into the Vedic, from the Vedic channel we mentioned before. So even when the Germans recovered the imperial insignia of Rome to say we want to continue this legacy, obviously you have to think they were ignorant, but they understood. I mean, they didn't obviously know all all the kind of superstructural reality of literature, of culture, of art that had been built massively around these concepts into the Hellenistic world. That all the knowledge had been lost, but from a genetical cultural point of view, they recognized that imperial insignia were, in this sense, they had magic value, because those were the ones to which the gods had given victory in the past. So it's not so simple. It's there is all a the time into which this has begun to change, really to get softer, paradoxically, was the Low Middle Ages. Like, the Low Middle Ages was a moment to which there was a kind of desacralization. I mean, not because the Ancien regime was always based, but it was mostly based on religion, on Christian legitimization than this ancient warlike Indo-European one, even though the Ancien regime was also had a very massive legacy of that as well, because the nobles believed to be superior by some let's say celestial sanction. But eventually, well, with the modern age, we kind of begin to rationalize, to secularize a bit. But even in the Roman or German relations, you have to understand these symbolisms. You have to understand the cultural intersections, the cultural homogeneity that existed at the time. These peoples weren't that different at all, and they all had their own common origin in part. I don't know how much this video sounds like an Indo-European propaganda or something, I don't know, but these are actually things that are studied out there. And that we know, habitually speaking, in history of religions, we are perfectly aware of such similarities, of such relations, and I think it's very important to recognize that. As it was present in the Hellenistic world, like the generals of Alexander, for instance, had pretty clear in mind, for instance, this divine sanction of their military success. Everything was based on, I mean, at the time, everything was based on the God's will. I mean, you couldn't start a battle if the omens were wrong. Even if the sacrifice had showed that there was some imperfection in the victim's guts, or the blood had spilled in a bad way, I mean, they wouldn't attack, because they thought that the gods were telling them that not to do, that it wasn't the right time. So naturally, also in here, that they were adjusting the whole thing. They would make, if they really needed to attack, because it was a favorable moment, I think, they would make blood spill in a certain way, in a way or another. It would make the guts would be limpid and the blood would have spurted well. But it was also a way to kind of say, okay, but maybe if there was a great defeat, for instance, well, that was a way to kind of say, okay, but it was maybe someone's fault because he didn't respect God's will. This is how also the whole thing was and this is why, however, relatively to all the symbolisms that we have seen, the Roman eagle was the first of the Roman insignia, and the most important one, and why it was chosen over the others. That as we have seen with Marius, up to Marius, there were other animals as well. So maybe there were other, and this corresponds, by the way, to an imperial ideology, if you consider the imperial ideology to be, in this sense, a bit a sober tribal. I mean, the idea that there is a deity that kind of goes up. In fact, if you, that rises above others in practice. In fact, if you see even the Roman religion, the Hellenistic religion, let's be frank about it, that how it had evolved before the eventually the rise of Christianity, you realize that it was still polytheism, but was a it's called anotheism, I believe. This kind of, there is a major deity, and then all the others follow, even in a sort of hierarchical fashion. This is a bit what Zoroastrianism can be also interpreted like. It's still monotheism, but it's a bit more variegated. And what you see is that this major deity, which was it? The sun. So also the sun was conceived in the sense as the perfect celestial, the greatest celestial power. And even early Christianism definitely had to kind of integrate these symbolisms, because that's what most people believed in. So many so-called Christians still believed in such things. We have certain letters from desperate bishops from, say, the 6th century that were worried because after the Mass, people went out of the church and still kneeled in front of the sun. The Sol Invictus, the undefeated sun. You realize Invictus, that has never been won by anyone else. You understand even here the military meaning attached to it. This was what they were believing, because the celestial deity could not be defeated. I mean, they had made it against the Titans. Surely that was the only might that could make mankind winning wars and battles. And so another interesting thing about this is that in the Roman armies, when essentially the auxiliary units were formalized, let's say, as part of the Roman military organic, with the Augustan reforms, so were created the cohortes, the ally, and the cohortes equitatae, the allies essentially. These couldn't bear the eagle as an insignia. We find other animals that were corresponding to their totemic, to the totemic deities of those peoples that weren't Roman. They were usually from other parts of. So you find, I don't know, the Taurus, the Aries, or other animals like that. They were still part of a symbology. And by the way, even the same Roman legions, they all had an eagle, but each one of them had a symbol on their own that was usually the one of an animal. Usually the Taurus, this powerful, the Capricorn. There was a lot of symbolism attached to that. That was kind of because the eagle, as we've seen, in this sense, had been issued as a standard thing, so it was a bit impersonal. I mean, it was the greatest expression of the celestial deity, but in this sense, every legion still had an esprit de corps that wanted to be expressed with their own legionary symbol. So these symbols were attached together. But it's interesting that in the sense the allies couldn't really have the eagle, because it was perceived that the eagle was just a Roman thing, that only the Romans had deserved that, because they had conquered the world. We're talking about Augustan times. Rome has de facto conquered the world from what the world meant for them at the time. So it would have been kind of sacrilegious in a certain fashion to give the eagle symbol to someone who had not deserved that, just like an ally that had just only joined the Romans in their effort to conquer the whole world, and not really accomplished anything without the Romans. That was the concept. So the eagle was a frightening thing, really, and a great privilege to serve in a unit that was symbolized by an eagle. And the eagle, in this sense, was eventually became the symbol of the empire proper, of the Imperium, that is the military, not the empire as we mean it today, but as the Romans meant it, that is this capability of waging arms that had been conferred, and of winning through them, that have been conferred by the celestial deity. Another interesting thing about this, though, is that certain allies, certain other populations, if you take the Celts and the Germans, they had the eagle symbol as well. Not as widespread as in the Roman world. We've seen that in the Roman world before the Augustan times, also in there, the eagle wasn't the only one that existed there, but we have evidence on Gallic helmets, for instance, of eagles that were found. The eagle also figures as one of the sacred animals of Odin, Odin, as you want to call him. And I don't know if you ever see that, but these winged helmets were worn by the ancient Central European warlords, where that was partly the symbol of the thing. The idea that they were eagles themselves. I mean, these were totemic animals, so as they wore bear skins or wolf skins, they could wear helmets with the wings, so that symbolized the idea of, I am the eagle, so I am guided as a leader by the greatest god, Odin, which was the god of war proper, It was seen, by the way, not in the, say, in the cocky military fashion like could be. Odin is a kind of dark figure. It's really about warfare given as a sort of fury that derives from being, in fact, I don't know how to say that, being given, being instilled by the deity, this kind of supernatural state. When the Germans shouted and behaved this beast-like fashion, apparently, telling the truth from their point of view. By the way, some of them were, well, whatever. But let's say that was conceived actually as being possessed by the divinity, or by the animal, by any other totemic deity that they thought to be. And that was considered, in that sense, a very complex thing, and that had to do with the afterlife, with the wisdom that only the gods and the spirits of the dead warriors could have essentially instilled to you in a non-human, or better, in a divine fashion. So we see that with Rome, this kind of happened in the same way, and I would like to conclude this video with some quotes about the eagle. There are many. There is one that makes me I wanted to find it. Was it the one from no, where is it? The one from Josephus, that I'm gonna searching because I can quote it better. Against the Roman eagle of Josephus, which is probably the most frightening. Josephus was writing at this time, you know, that we were talking about. He's one of the greatest authors of Imperial Rome. He was a Roman Jewish. He was a Roman citizen of Jewish. He was named a citizen during the Flavi dynasty, so his Roman name was Flavus. It was habitual practice, and Josephus then instead is the Latinization of I don't know what's the Jewish original name in Hebrew, but it's Josephus in Latin, and he was essentially writing to obviously to celebrate Roman military might in some fashion, and he wrote something terrible about the standards and the Roman eagle. So here I have a translation in English to make it sound less mechanic than I would. So he was talking essentially about the Roman order of battle in this the advancing legions, and he says, after this came the commanders of the cohorts and tribunes, having around them selected soldiers. Then came the standards surrounding the eagle, which is at the head of every Roman legion. Both the king and the most warlike of all birds, which seems to them a sure sign of empire, and an omen that they shall conquer all against whom they march. And then he adds, these sacred things, important, are followed by the trumpeters, etc. So here it gives really, Josephus was understanding clearly. It was all about the eagle. It was about the eagle conferring the Romans their confidence of conquering, that they shall, so not just of trying to conquer, but that they will conquer everything against all of whom they march. You have to think, it's fascinating now because a Jew was writing now, and the Jews were, well, they're reasonably famous for their idea to be the chosen people. And aside from them, the other great, the people that probably believed the most into this that they were a chosen people were the Romans. I mean, the Romans were generally they were generally believed that it was their destiny to rule the world. And you know what were the third ones? At least in the West, the Carolingians. The Carolingians were obsessed by the ancient testament, that is the Jewish, and also pretty warlike. That's what the Franks liked so much. The ancient testament, it was all about war, and and that what the Franks actually were at the times of the Carolingians, and the Roman legacy. So Charlemagne, who was considering himself of being the Roman emperor in this sense, acquiring the eagle's insignia. The Carolingians started wearing the eagle as a symbol, and started conceiving the fact that they were chosen, just like the Jews and just like the Romans, as a people to carry out their destiny in front of God, as God had wished. And this is something that I believe, if you don't understand in history, you can't really understand very little about it all. Because the more I like to study military history, and I have this passion, and sometimes I just like the more mechanic things, but I realized that, as von Clausewitz says, by the way, that the first thing in war is about moral resources, before then anything else, before weapons, before numbers, before the first thing, it's moral forces, because the first objective of war is to bend the enemy at your to your will. That's the only objective of war, from Clausewitz. That's the objective of war, and the more and the more I read about these cultural aspects of war, and the more I realize that they go pretty much beyond our own beliefs. I mean, I think the modern military, obviously there is a great deal of pride and esprit de corps, and I like modern military, etc. But I realize that there is a pretty much secular mind in there. I mean, these people, yeah, they might be fighting for their families, for having a career, for many reasons, actually, for their country, naturally, as it's often, the flag, there is this symbolism that is basically fighting for a symbol to which you attach a great meaning. But we are talking in 2019. I mean, we live in a society into which this is getting pretty relative in many ways. If you go studying instead these peoples at the time, you realize that they truly saw this reason of fighting in a much both wider and deeper way. I mean, really, the whole destiny of these civilizations was felt by themselves to be accomplished in military victory, in conquering the world, because it was believed as a mean to reach and to participate to the divine nature, at least to go close to it at the point of living a grandiose life, which is something you can't understand, especially under the light. I mean, why are we so secularized at this today? Because today we know that we can't do that, but at the same time we have we live better, so we have less interest to participate to divine nature in some way, at least in part, because it depends on how we interpret religion and but generally speaking, in everyday life, we're kind of satisfied by. We have also to understand ourselves to do things that we just want, because we don't have excessive worries. We kind of live fine, at least compared to even in the worst situations today, to how they lived back at the time. At the time, they didn't know physics. They believed in ghosts and spirits and in these divine entities. It was obvious that the only way for them to win death, to solve their problems, was also partly to this. That's why they believed so much in these gods. It's not because they were stupid. It's because they had a moral force. Say they had certain pushes that today we can't understand anymore. They were forced in part to do this, and as bad as it can sound to us, because we have seen how the eagle has been taken by, I don't know, by take Nazi Germany, take fascist Italy, and but in general, I mean, there have been lots of powers around the world that has taken that have been inspired by the Romans and that have done horrible things, including the Romans themselves. I mean, the Romans slaughtered a huge amount of people, and that's what basically everybody else did in their own smaller capabilities. So there is really no better or worse person at that time. That was the standard moral thing. There was the right of conquest, and you had to accept that in a way or another. And but so I don't want to push this Indo-European thing as an Aryan that is a sort of racist thing at all. But I'm just extremely fascinated, and I think actually that our awareness to actually criticize things like Nazi Germany or all the bad things that have been done in the world by anyone. I'm not making relativism relatively to the quantity, but humans are kind of evil potentially all the same way, so we all do something bad. So I don't want to take the eagle as saying we should go back conquering other, but I think it's important for us today to be aware of this meaning, to be aware that this is being where we come from, and that we have completely forgotten. This is what really frightens me. I believe that history has to be known essentially to understand the world we live in. If you understand where these things came from, well, it's gonna be I don't want to fall into the cliche that you're gonna repeat the mistake, because I don't believe that history ever repeated itself, not even once. But I mean, we can do better if we know that, if we know our past. So about this thing about the the Roman eagle, even myself, I was pretty ignorant about it up to a few times ago, and even today I'm not an expert, as you can understand, but it really struck me. I mean, I was really moved by reading about the Decursio, I mean, the imperial Apotheosis, and there are lots of other things that are actually very, very important. I would like to quote. There's also another interesting, another thing about, thing or two about the Roman things, the Roman eagle. That is that it even actually the other peoples knew what the eagle represented for the Romans. They basically all knew that. And for instance, Corbulo, in the famous Roman general, who fought, I think under Nero, and the one that destroyed the Parthian kingdom for the first time. In order to trick the Parthians at a certain point, he deployed the legionary eagles at the head of the only legion that he had. So basically, trying to trick them to make them think that there were less troops in there. It's kind of interesting because it's actually pretty. I mean, I don't know how much the legionnaires would have been happy about this. I mean, it's true that, as we've seen, the military might is. I mean, war is won also by treachery and this kind of disloyal means. But in this sense, think about those legionnaires whose eagle had been taken away, and it's a pretty cunning move. I mean, Corbulo is one of the greatest generals of Roman history, but what is interesting here is that the eagle could be was so famous even among our populations, like the Parthians, that were, had grown had met the Romans just essentially from more than 1 century at that time. so to trick even from a tactical point of view the enemy. In this case, by showing to have less forces than they were. This is quoted, by the way, by Tacitus in the Annales 1338. And the so naturally, maybe I haven't stressed this much, but the symbol of the eagle is also the symbol of Rome herself. Like Rome, in imperial terms, was conceived as indeed the city that Jupiter had chosen from a Roman perspective. That is, it's not just about showing us to be protected by the celestial god, but also the fact that we are Romans proper. As obviously Rome in this sense was not conceived just as the physical city, but as the citizenship that was attached to. I mean, every legionnaire was a citizen, and that meant that the Roman Empire had been built by extending Rome in that fashion, and also in by founding many other Romes, let's say, all around the various Roman colonies that eventually were populated with Roman citizens. And that's a great thing, unknown in the ancient world. So there is a quote always from Tacitus Annales. This is 1217. That tells a very beautiful thing about before the battle of Idastavisus. That is essentially the Germanicus hit back on Germany after the defeat of the Teutoburg forest. And it says something, this is before the battle. I'm quoting and translating a bit for just like a fortune's omen, Germanicus saw 8 eagles that were flying towards the forests where the Germans were, by the way, were deployed, and he commanded then to his soldiers to march ahead, to march forwards, and to follow the birds, symbol of Rome, protectors of the legions. Now this is probably, of all things we have read, probably the most beautiful thing, because it tells you how these people actually believed. I mean, think about be a Roman soldier, and what was your what were your hopes or your expectation? But the real thing was that the eagle, that as long as you remain under the eagle, if you defend the eagle, if you protect the eagle, if you fight under the eagle, you're gonna be victorious. And being victorious was the most beautiful thing it could be conceived at the time, because life was crap, and the greatest thing that you could achieve was to be remembered by glorious deeds, and that was a little bit the edicts that remained. Even we know once I read about a 7th century Byzantine battle, or I don't remember. It was a study about the Byzantine army. I don't remember who it was, and it was talking about the military edicts that existed into the Christian empire at the time. And basically you realize that into that Byzantine army, 7th century, well, 17th century maybe, the 7th century Byzantine army, actually the military edicts had nothing to do with Christianism. I mean, those people were Christian, but as long as they were in the army, they had a military edicts that really recalled all the ethical, let's say, the classical world. This purely warlike, mundane, I mean, not really mundane, but this kind of very non-Christian thing of the glory of bloodshed, of killing people, of being individually valid and strong and powerful. And this is also kind of meaningful to say that probably there are certain well, those were different times from our own, but there is probably something the more I study these things, the more I'm convinced that there was a great continuity from polytheism up to this day in many ways, and that there are certain things that also are stemmed in those Indo-European roots that we were talking about that have really never left in our cultures. And yes, so for now I quit because this is getting way too long. And I just hope that you enjoyed this video, because I didn't know how up to 5 minutes before starting it what I would have liked to talk about, but it's been fun, it's been nice. I think aside from my poor linguistical skills, that I have told what I really wanted to tell, and therefore, as always, if you enjoyed this video, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested about my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.